In the middle of a Montana blizzard, when roads disappeared and even wildlife sought shelter, a police officer heard something that should not have existed. Not a scream, not a cry for help, just a weak sound, breaking through the wind. What he found beneath the snow was not just a tragedy, it was proof that love can outlast fear, and that some lives survive only because someone refused to walk away. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Kalispell, Montana, sat under a winter storm that left no room for negotiation. Snow fell hard and fast, driven sideways by wind that scraped across open ground and funneled through the streets. Visibility dropped to a few dozen yards at best. Road markings disappeared beneath fresh layers of white, and even familiar intersections lost their shape. This was the kind of weather that did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It came as promised, stayed longer than expected, and punished anyone who treated it lightly. Most of the town had gone still. Businesses were closed, traffic reduced to necessity. Snowplows had already passed, but the effort felt temporary, almost symbolic, as drifts rebuilt themselves within minutes. Beyond the city limits, the land rose toward dense forest, where pine and fir trees stood bent beneath the weight of snow, their branches groaning softly whenever the wind shifted. Deputy Ethan Cole drove a county patrol vehicle along a secondary road that traced the edge of that forest. He kept his speed well below the limit, hands steady on the wheel, eyes moving constantly between the road ahead, the tree line, and the instrument panel. Ethan was 41 years old, tall and lean, with a build shaped more by years of physical labor than deliberate training. His dark hair showed early streaks of gray, and a short practical beard framed a face defined by sharp cheekbones and a square jaw. There was little softness in his features, but there was no hardness for its own sake either. He looked like a man who had learned to measure his reactions. Ethan had grown up in Montana. He understood storms like this not as events, but as conditions. Earlier in his life, he had worked as a wildland firefighter. One late-season operation, complicated by shifting winds and delayed extraction, had ended badly. A fellow firefighter had not made it out. The incident had not broken Ethan, but it had altered him. Since then, caution had become instinct rather than choice. He trusted process, preparation, and patience. He did not chase urgency unless it was proven. The radio crackled intermittently with updates from dispatch, road closures, welfare checks postponed until daylight, a reminder to limit exposure. Ethan acknowledged when required and lowered the volume again. Silence inside the vehicle helped him think. It also helped him listen. In the rear of the cruiser lay Atlas, his canine partner. Atlas was a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois, lean and athletic, with a sable coat darkened along his back and muzzle. His ears stood upright even at rest, and his eyes, a deep amber, tracked movement without obvious effort. Atlas had been selected for his focus as much as his physical ability. He was trained in tracking, search, and rescue, and detection work, but what set him apart was restraint. He did not waste energy. He did not react unless there was reason. Atlas lay still, body relaxed but ready, breathing slow and controlled. He was not asleep. Ethan had learned early on that Atlas's stillness meant attention, not rest. Over 3 years of working together, they had developed an unspoken understanding. Ethan trusted Atlas's signals. Atlas trusted Ethan to read them. As the cruiser approached a narrow turnout half buried under drifting snow, Ethan eased off the accelerator. This stretch of road had a history: slid-off vehicles, occasional injuries when conditions were underestimated. He brought the vehicle to a controlled stop, set the brake, and let the engine idle. Heat continued to flow through the cab, a steady contrast to the storm outside. For a moment, nothing changed. Then Atlas shifted. It was a small adjustment, barely visible. His head lifted, his ears angled forward, his posture tightened just enough to register. Ethan noticed immediately. He glanced back through the partition. "What is it?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. Atlas did not look at him. His attention was fixed on the tree line to the left, where the forest sloped downward and disappeared into blowing snow. His nostrils flared as he tested the air. His breathing slowed further. Ethan listened. Wind moved through the trees, carrying loose snow and the low creak of branches. There were no engines, no voices, no obvious signs of trouble. Under storm protocol, This should have been the end of it. He reached toward the radio, then stopped. Atlas stood and pressed his nose once against the rear door. Ethan frowned. They had not been dispatched. There was no call pending. Leaving the vehicle in these conditions was discouraged unless there was clear cause. Atlas let out a low sound. Not a bark, not a growl. It was brief, controlled, and carried urgency without alarm. Ethan exhaled slowly. He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the leash. "All right," he said, calm and measured. "Show me." The cold hit immediately when the door opened. Wind drove snow into the cab, sharp against exposed skin. Ethan clipped the leash to Atlas's collar and stepped out, adjusting his footing as his boots sank into packed snow. Atlas moved ahead without pulling, guiding rather than dragging, his head low, his body aligned with purpose. They left the road and entered the tree line. Snow reached mid-calf within a few steps. The forest dampened the wind slightly, replacing it with a heavy quiet, broken by the resistance of snow underfoot. Atlas navigated carefully, choosing a path that avoided deeper drifts. Ethan followed, flashlight in hand, scanning the ground and the surrounding brush. They had gone less than 50 yards when Atlas stopped. He lifted one paw, body rigid. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the moment when instinct preceded explanation. He swept the flashlight beam across the slope ahead. At first there was nothing, then a sound reached him. It was faint, strained, and easily lost beneath the wind. Short enough to doubt, weak enough to miss. Ethan froze. Atlas surged forward, leash snapping taut for a moment before Ethan followed. The flashlight beam caught something dark against the white. Fur crusted with ice, partially buried where snow had drifted deeper. Ethan slowed as they approached, movements controlled. He knelt beside the shape and felt his stomach drop. A large dog lay there, body rigid, coat stiff with frost. Thick furs marked her as northern breed, husky or similar. Her eyes were closed, lashes rimmed white. She was already gone. Ethan swallowed and shifted the light, instinctively scanning for context, for tracks, for explanation. Atlas stepped forward and positioned himself between Ethan and the body, standing sideways. It was not aggression, it was deliberate. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight. Beneath the frozen dog's chest, tucked impossibly close, something moved, a tiny shape, shaking violently. The sound came again, weak, broken, but unmistakably alive. Ethan's breath caught as realization set in. The storm had taken one life. It had not taken everything, and whatever came next would not wait for daylight. Ethan did not rush. Every instinct urged him to move faster, to close the distance immediately, but experience held him in place for a brief, necessary second. He knelt beside the frozen body of the dog, careful not to disturb her position, and adjusted the beam of his flashlight. The dog was large, female, her build solid beneath the ice-crusted fur. Even in death, there was intention in the way she lay, her torso curved inward, her weight distributed to shield what lay beneath. That alone told Ethan this had not been random collapse. Animals did not die like this by accident. Atlas stood rigid at his side, amber eyes fixed on the small movement under the dog's chest. His posture was controlled, protective without aggression, as if he understood the fragility of the moment. Ethan reached slowly, sliding one gloved hand beneath the frozen dog's ribcage. Warmth was gone entirely from the mother, but beneath her, his fingers brushed something that flinched. The puppy was impossibly small. Newborn, eyes sealed shut, its body shaking in short, uneven tremors. Its coat was thin and damp, already stiffening where the cold had begun to take hold. The sound it made was barely audible now, more breath than voice. Ethan had seen hypothermia before, in people and animals, and he recognized the danger signs immediately. Time was no longer an abstract concept. It was a measurable, shrinking margin. He removed his outer jacket with one hand, movements awkward but precise, and wrapped the puppy carefully, shielding it from the wind. Atlas lowered himself closer, angling his body to block the worst of the gusts. The dog did not touch the puppy. He simply reduced the space where cold could reach. Ethan stood, turning back toward the road. Each step through the snow felt heavier than the last. The storm pressed against him, wind pushing from the side, testing balance and resolve. Atlas stayed close, glancing once over his shoulder toward the frozen dog before refocusing forward. Ethan noticed the look. It was not hesitation, it was memory. The cruiser came into view as a darker shape against the white. Ethan opened the rear door and climbed inside, cradling the bundle beneath his coat. The interior heat felt almost wrong after the cold, but he knew warming had to be gradual. He started the engine, adjusted the temperature upward in small increments, and checked the puppy's breathing. Shallow, irregular, but present. Atlas jumped into the back without command and lay down immediately, pressing his body close to Ethan's side. His breathing slowed, deliberate, as if offering steadiness by example. Ethan drove with controlled urgency, tires biting cautiously into the road. The storm erased their tracks almost as soon as they moved, snow filling the shallow impressions left behind. The forest receded, swallowed again by white. The emergency veterinary clinic sat on the outskirts of Kalispell, a low, utilitarian building with lights that never fully went, dark. Ethan pulled in hard and killed the engine. The moment he opened the door, cold rushed back in, but the puppy did not stir. That worried him more than the trembling had. Inside, the clinic smelled of disinfectant and wet fur. A woman looked up from the front desk, her posture shifting instantly from routine to alert. Her name was Sarah Whitman, early 30s, average height, slender build, with light brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail that suggested long shifts rather than deliberate style. Her skin was pale, freckled across the nose, and her eyes, gray and quick, took in details rapidly. She had the focused calm of someone still close enough to training to remember every rule, but experienced enough to know when to bend them. "What have you got?" Sarah asked, already moving around the desk. "Neonatal puppy," Ethan said. "Severe hypothermia, mother deceased." Sarah nodded once. "Treatment room 2. She pushed through swinging doors, calling for assistance as she went. The room was bright and warm, stainless steel surfaces reflecting overhead lights. Sarah laid out warming pads and towels with practiced efficiency. Another technician entered briefly, then stepped back when Atlas followed Ethan inside and settled beside the table. Sarah glanced at the dog, then at Ethan. "He's working," Ethan said. She hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "All right, but he stays calm." Atlas stayed still. They transferred the puppy carefully onto the warming surface, monitoring its breathing and heart rate. Sarah's movements were precise, her voice steady as she called out observations. The puppy's chest fluttered weakly, then steadied just enough to register on the monitor. It was not safe, but it was alive. A few minutes later, Dr. Lillian Moore entered the room. She was in her late 30s, tall and straight-backed, with dark hair cut just below the jaw, and eyes that carried both fatigue and control. Her face was angular, her expression reserved, the kind shaped by years of difficult outcomes rather than optimism. She had built her reputation on composure, under pressure, not warmth. She listened as Ethan summarized the find. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she washed her hands and examined the puppy, then turned her attention to the body of the mother, which Ethan had brought in wrapped separately. "This isn't just exposure," Lillian said quietly after a moment. She brushed snow from the fur around the neck, fingers careful. She was compromised before the cold finished the job. Atlas's head lifted immediately. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a growl, but a warning. Lillian paused. She adjusted the light and parted the fur. There, barely visible against the skin, was a small puncture mark. Clean, precise. "That shouldn't be there," she said. Ethan felt the weight of the night settle fully into place. This was no longer a rescue alone. It was something else entirely. They stabilized the puppy enough to continue treatment and secured the mother's body for further examination. Sarah moved quietly, her earlier efficiency giving way to a more subdued focus. She avoided looking at the puncture mark longer than necessary. Ethan completed initial reports at a small desk near the treatment room, Atlas lying at his feet. The storm continued outside, but inside the clinic, time slowed into measured actions and careful decisions. Ethan knew better than to draw conclusions too early, but instinct, his own and Atlas's, told him this was not an isolated tragedy. When he finally stepped back to look at the puppy again, its breathing had evened into a fragile rhythm. Atlas remained close, eyes tracking the small rise and fall of the tiny chest. Ethan rested a hand briefly on the dog's back. "We did what we could tonight," he said quietly. Atlas did not move. He did not need reassurance. Whatever had brought them into the storm was not finished yet, and neither were they. Morning came slowly to Kalispell, not with light so much as with a thinning of darkness. The storm had eased overnight, leaving behind a brittle calm and a city buried under the quiet aftermath of wind and snow. The sky remained low and gray, pressing down on rooftops and treetops alike. Roads were passable but narrow, flanked by banks of snow pushed aside in uneven walls. The forest beyond town looked unchanged, as if nothing had happened there at all. Ethan Cole returned to the veterinary clinic shortly after sunrise. He had not gone home. Instead, he had spent the remaining hours of the night in his cruiser, parked along a cleared side street, Atlas resting in the back. Sleep had come in fragments, never deep enough to dull awareness. The image of the frozen dog and the small movement beneath her chest had replayed without invitation. Inside the clinic, the atmosphere was quieter than it had been during the night shift. Fewer voices, slower footsteps. The urgency had not vanished, but it had narrowed into focus. Sarah Whitman looked up as Ethan entered. Her ponytail had been redone, neater now, and she carried a clipboard tucked against her chest. Fatigue showed faintly beneath her eyes, but her movements remained efficient. "He made it through the night," she said before Ethan could ask. "Still critical, but stable." Ethan nodded once. Relief registered briefly, then settled into caution. "Can I see him?" Sarah gestured toward the treatment area. Atlas followed without instruction, padding quietly at Ethan's side. The puppy lay under controlled warmth, wrapped and monitored. His breathing was steadier than before, still shallow but consistent. Atlas stopped a few feet away and lay down, chin resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the small rise and fall of the puppy's chest. Dr. Lillian Moore joined them moments later. She looked as she always did, composed, reserved, but there was tension in the way she held her shoulders, a subtle stiffness that suggested unresolved concern. "I completed a preliminary exam on the mother," she said, keeping her voice low. "The cold killed her, but it wasn't the initial cause. She was already weakened." Ethan leaned against the counter, listening. "The puncture we saw last night was clean and recent," Lillian continued. "Small gauge needle, not an animal bite, not debris. I can't tell you what compound without lab work, but I can tell you it wasn't accidental." Atlas's ears lifted slightly at the sound of her voice, but he did not move. Ethan exhaled slowly. "So she didn't wander out there on her own?" "No," Lillian said. "And she didn't lie down like that by chance." Sarah glanced toward the puppy, then back at Ethan. "She positioned herself," she said quietly. "Even after whatever was done to her." The statement landed with weight. Ethan had seen animals protect offspring before, but this felt deliberate in a way that lingered. "Can you preserve samples?" Ethan asked. Lillian nodded. "Already done. Tissue and swabs. If you want toxicology, I'll coordinate with the state lab." "I do," Ethan said, "as soon as possible." They stepped out into the hallway, away from the treatment room. Ethan pulled out his notebook and made brief entries, precise and unemotional. Documentation mattered now. Whatever this became would depend on details recorded early. As he finished, the clinic door opened again. A man stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with a thick gray beard that covered much of his jaw. His hair was cut short, practical, and his eyes were a darker blue than Ethan's, heavy-lidded but alert. He wore a county sheriff's jacket, worn at the cuffs. This was Sheriff Daniel Mercer. He had been in law enforcement for over 30 years, most of them in Flathead County. Experience had shaped him into someone direct and unsentimental. Years earlier, a case involving a missing teenager had gone cold under his watch, not for lack of effort, but for lack of evidence. Since then, Mercer trusted facts over impressions and moved carefully when uncertainty was involved. "Cole," Mercer said, nodding once. "Heard you had something unusual." Ethan briefed him concisely. The location, the conditions, the dog, the puppy, the puncture mark. Mercer listened without interruption, hands resting on his belt. "Animal cruelty?" Mercer asked when Ethan finished. "Possibly more," Ethan replied. "The method suggests access to veterinary supplies and intent." Mercer glanced toward Atlas, who lay still but attentive. "Your dog reacted to it." "Yes." Mercer considered that. He had worked with canine units long enough to respect their limits and their value. "All right," he said. "Let's treat it like a potential criminal matter, quietly, no assumptions yet." They agreed on next steps. Ethan would return to the site with Atlas once conditions allowed. Mercer would initiate a preliminary case file and authorize lab work. No press, no outreach, not yet. By mid-morning, the sky had lifted enough to allow clearer visibility. Ethan drove back toward the forest road, Mercer following in a separate vehicle. The snow had settled into a hard crust, broken only where plows or tires had passed. The turnout where Ethan had stopped the night before was still visible, though softened by fresh accumulation. They parked and stepped out. The cold was less aggressive now, but it still carried weight. Atlas emerged from the cruiser, posture alert, nose already testing the air. Ethan gave the command. Atlas moved forward, slow and deliberate. There were no tracks left, no clear path. The storm had erased all obvious signs of passage. Ethan noted it without frustration. This was expected. Atlas worked the area methodically, circling once, then twice. His movements were controlled, head low, tail steady. He paused near the tree line, inhaled deeply, and shifted direction. Ethan followed, marking their route on his GPS. They descended the slope toward where the dog had been found. The body had already been removed, leaving behind an empty impression in the snow. Atlas stopped there briefly, then moved on, nose sweeping in short arcs. Several minutes passed without change. Mercer watched quietly, arms folded, breath visible in the cold air. He did not rush the process. He had learned long ago that pressure rarely produced clarity. Then Atlas halted abruptly. He pawed once at the snow and stepped back. Ethan crouched and brushed away the surface layer. Beneath it lay a small piece of plastic, partially cracked, a syringe barrel. The cap was missing. Faint residue clung to the inside. Ethan felt a tightening behind his ribs. This was no longer circumstantial. Mercer exhaled through his nose. That confirms it. They photographed the find, logged coordinates, airborness, and secured the evidence. Atlas did not approach the syringe again. He stood off to the side, body tense, eyes fixed. The signal was clear. They expanded the search radius slightly, but found nothing more. That too was information. Whoever had done this had not lingered. Back at the vehicles, Mercer pulled out his phone and made a brief call. "I want a quiet check on recent veterinary supply orders in the county," he said. "Anything unusual? No alerts." He turned to Ethan. "This stays small for now, but it's moving." Ethan nodded. His attention drifted back toward the forest, toward the place where a storm had tried to hide something and failed. They returned to town in silence. At the clinic, Sarah met them at the door. "The puppy's still stable," she said. "Dr. Moore wants you to know she'll call as soon as the lab responds." Ethan thanked her and knelt briefly beside Atlas, resting a hand on the dog's shoulder. Atlas leaned into the touch, then settled again, attention fixed on the hallway beyond. Whatever had started in the storm was no longer contained by it. The cold had taken what it could. The rest was now in motion. The evidence locker at the Flathead County Sheriff's Office was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that came from routine rather than calm. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow on metal shelves and sealed containers. Ethan Cole stood at the counter while a technician logged the syringe they had recovered from the snow. Atlas lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes open. He watched hands more than faces, a habit that came from training and experience. Sheriff Daniel Mercer joined them moments later, coat still dusted with snow along the shoulders. He removed his gloves and set them aside, revealing hands thickened by years of field work. The beard that framed his face gave him a rough appearance, but his eyes were precise, always assessing, never drifting. "That syringe goes straight to the lab," Mercer said. "Chain of custody stays clean." The technician nodded and slid the evidence bag into a marked tray. Ethan watched it disappear behind a locked door. It felt like a line being crossed. Up until now, the case had been defined by what they had found. From here on, it would be shaped by what they could prove. They moved into a small briefing room just off the main hall. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant. A whiteboard covered one wall, already marked with notes from unrelated cases. Mercer erased a section and began writing as Ethan spoke. "One syringe, small gauge, likely veterinary use," Ethan said. "No tracks at the site. Whoever left it knew the storm would cover their exit." Mercer nodded. And they were right. Atlas shifted slightly as Mercer spoke, ears angling forward. He had learned the cadence of Ethan's voice and the tone of Mercer's. This was work now, not observation. A knock sounded at the door. A man stepped in without waiting for an invitation. He was in his mid-30s, lean to the point of sharpness, with close-cropped hair and a clean-shaven face that looked perpetually tired. His name was Caleb Ruiz, a county investigator assigned to regulatory and agricultural offenses. He wore plain clothes and carried a tablet under one arm. "I pulled recent veterinary supply orders," Caleb said. His voice was steady but quick, as if his thoughts moved faster than his speech. "Nothing flagged through licensed clinics, but there's a gap." Mercer looked up. "Explain." 3 months ago, a private account stopped ordering altogether. No explanation. The clinic closed quietly. Owner surrendered his license last year. Name's Dr. Aaron Klein. Ethan's attention sharpened. "Why surrender?" Caleb hesitated briefly. "Disciplinary action pending. Improper record keeping, unreported treatments, nothing criminal on paper, but enough to shut him down." Mercer tapped the marker against the board once. "Where's Klein now?" "Address on file is a rural property west of town," Caleb said. "Old ranch land, mostly out of sight." The room settled into silence for a moment. This was the first concrete direction the case had offered. "We don't go in heavy," Mercer said finally. "Not yet. We observe. We verify." Ethan nodded. He preferred it that way. Atlas lifted his head as if in agreement. They left the office just before dusk. The sky had darkened again, clouds thickening, threatening another round of snow. Ethan drove the cruiser while Mercer followed as in an unmarked vehicle. The road narrowed as they moved west, pavement giving way to gravel, then packed dirt lined by fencing half buried under snow. The property appeared gradually, not announced by signs or lights. A long drive cut through open ground toward a low structure set back against a line of trees. The house itself was modest, weathered wood siding grayed by years of exposure. A barn stood farther back, its roof sagging slightly under accumulated snow. They parked well short of the entrance. Ethan cut the engine. The cold crept in immediately, quiet and persistent. Atlas exited the vehicle and stood alert, nose lifting to test the air. He did not pull forward. He waited. Mercer scanned the area with binoculars. "No vehicles, no lights. Doesn't mean no one's here," Ethan said. They approached on foot, keeping to the tree line. The snow muffled their steps. Atlas moved ahead, controlled and deliberate. His posture changed as they neared the structures. Head lower, tail still, muscles engaged. Ethan recognized the shift. This was not curiosity. It was confirmation. They did not cross the property boundary. Instead, they circled wide, documenting what they could see from public land. Near the barn, half hidden by snow and brush, Ethan spotted something out of place. He crouched, brushing away the surface layer with a gloved hand. Medical waste, plastic tubing, an empty vial, label scratched but not fully removed. Mercer exhaled slowly. "That's enough for probable cause." Atlas stiffened suddenly, head snapping toward the barn. His ears flattened slightly, body angling forward. Ethan froze, hand tightening on the leash. A sound carried faintly through the still air, low, muffled, not wind, a whine, then another. Ethan's jaw set. He did not need to be told what that meant. "We stop here," Mercer said quietly. "We have what we need." They documented the site thoroughly, photographs taken, coordinates logged. Atlas remained tense the entire time, eyes fixed on the structure beyond the fence. He did not bark. He did not pull. He waited. Back in town, the warrant process moved faster than Ethan expected. The combination of the syringe, the buried medical waste, and the audible presence of animals confined under questionable conditions was enough. By the time full darkness settled, authorization had been granted. They returned with additional units just after midnight. The approach was controlled, deliberate. No sirens, no shouted commands. The goal was containment, not confrontation. Ethan led with Atlas. The barn door was locked, but the lock was old, corroded. It gave way with minimal force. The smell hit them immediately. Chemicals, stale bedding, and fear. Inside, the space was divided into makeshift enclosures. Cages lined the walls, some stacked, others reinforced with scrap wood. Dogs filled them. Too many. Most were German shepherds or similar working breeds, underweight, eyes wide, bodies tense. Several had shaved patches on their necks, skin irritated where injections had been administered. Atlas stepped forward slowly. His posture softened deliberately, head low, movements calm. The effect was immediate. The nearest dogs stopped pacing. Some lowered themselves to the ground. Others watched him with guarded attention. Ethan documented everything, methodically, while other deputies secured the area. No one rushed. Panic would only make it worse. Dr. Aaron Klein was not present. That fact registered, but it did not slow the process. They had enough. By the time animal control arrived, the situation was stable. Dogs were removed one by one, wrapped in blankets, carried carefully into waiting vehicles. Atlas remained until the last cage was empty, watching each animal leave as if counting. When it was over, the barn stood silent. Back at the clinic, Sarah Whitman met them at the door again. Her expression tightened when she saw the convoy of transport crates. "All of them?" she asked. "All of them," Ethan said. The puppy was still stable, still fighting. Ethan stood for a moment outside the treatment room, Atlas at his side. The case had moved from suspicion to certainty in less than a day. The storm had failed to erase what mattered. It had only delayed it. The arrest warrant for Dr. Aaron Klein was issued just after dawn. It did not come with urgency in its language, but it carried weight in its implications. By the time the document was signed, the case had moved beyond animal cruelty into territory that involved controlled substances, illegal confinement, and deliberate harm. Ethan Cole read the warrant twice, not because the wording was complex, but because it marked a clear shift. This was no longer about what had already been uncovered. It was about what had been avoided for too long. The search for Klein began quietly. Sheriff Daniel Mercer made it clear that there would be no public statements and no patrol-wide alerts. Whoever Klein was, he had already demonstrated a preference for isolation and foresight. Ethan understood the reasoning. Men like that did not respond well to pressure. They retreated, adjusted, and waited. Ethan returned to the clinic first. The rescued dogs had been stabilized overnight and moved into temporary holding spaces arranged by animal control. The building felt different now, louder, but not chaotic. Dogs barked intermittently, some sharp and defensive, others thin and uncertain. The sound carried down the hallways and lingered, a reminder of what had been hidden. Sarah Whitman moved between enclosures with practiced efficiency, her earlier reserve replaced by quiet determination. She had changed clothes since the night before, trading her scrubs for a sweater layered under a clinic vest. Her posture remained upright, but her movements were quicker, more deliberate. "The puppy's holding," she said as Ethan approached. "Still fragile, but responsive." Ethan nodded and stepped into the treatment room. Atlas followed and settled immediately beside the enclosure, his presence steady. The puppy lay curled beneath controlled warmth, eyes still sealed, chest rising and falling with measured effort. There was no sound now, just breath. Dr. Lillian Moore joined them shortly after. She looked tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. Fatigue had sharpened her features, drawing lines more clearly around her eyes. Still, her voice was steady. "Toxicology confirmed a sedative," she said. "Low dose. Enough to weaken muscle control and breathing over time, not enough to kill quickly." Ethan absorbed that in silence. "She would have been conscious," Lillian added. "At least at first." Atlas lifted his head at the sound of her voice. He did not react further. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Do we know where it came from?" "Restricted compound," Lillian said. "Veterinary use only. Regulated." That narrowed the field more than anything else had so far. By mid-morning, Ethan and Mercer regrouped at the sheriff's office. Caleb Ruiz joined them again, tablet already in hand. His focus had sharpened since the previous day. This was his element now. "Klein's financial records are thin," Caleb said. "No recent income reported. Utilities on the property were paid irregularly. But he didn't disappear. He planned." Mercer leaned back in his chair. Meaning he's got another place," Caleb said. "Something temporary. Or someone letting him lie low." Ethan studied the map spread across the table. He noticed a cluster of properties beyond the ranch they had already searched. Old holdings, former breeding operations that had shut down years earlier. One in particular stood out, a small parcel near the edge of a defunct logging road. "That one," Ethan said. "Who owns it?" Caleb tapped the screen. "Technically still Klein, no recent activity recorded, but that doesn't mean it's unused." Mercer nodded once. "That's where we start." They waited until late afternoon to move. The sky had cleared enough to offer visibility, though the cold remained firm. Ethan drove with Atlas in the back, both of them quiet. The road narrowed again as they left the main route, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The structure appeared suddenly, less hidden than forgotten. A single-story outbuilding, metal siding dulled by age, set back from the road and partially shielded by bare trees. There were no lights, no smoke, no signs of recent habitation. They parked and approached on foot. Atlas's posture shifted immediately, his head lowered, ears angled forward, muscles engaged. Ethan felt the change through the leash. Inside, the air was stale. The space was sparse, almost deliberately so. A cot, a folding table. Shelving units lined one wall, holding medical supplies and handwritten notebooks. The handwriting was meticulous, clinical. Dates, dosages, observations. This was where Klein had worked after losing his license. Ethan flipped through one notebook slowly. Entries detailed breeding cycles, outcomes, adjustments. There was no emotion in the writing, only results. Mercer read over his shoulder. He wasn't improvising, he said. He was refining. Atlas stopped him at the far wall and sat. Ethan followed his gaze. A second door, partially concealed behind shelving. He opened it carefully. Inside were more cages, fewer than before, smaller, recently used. The silence pressed in. They did not find Klein there, but they found enough to know he had left in a hurry. Food untouched, bedding disturbed, a vehicle track outside, not yet fully erased by snow. The chase did not take long after that. Klein was located 2 towns over, attempting to sell supplies at a private exchange that catered to rural veterinarians and breeders. He did not resist arrest. When Ethan saw him up close for the first time, he understood something important. Dr. Aaron Klein was not imposing. He was in his mid-40s, average height, narrow shoulders, slightly hunched, as if accustomed to working alone. His hair had thinned unevenly, and his beard was patchy, untrimmed. His eyes avoided direct contact, not out of fear, but calculation. He spoke politely, too politely. Years earlier, Klein had been respected in small circles. A methodical veterinarian, praised for efficiency. When oversight increased, when regulations tightened, he had not adapted. He had withdrawn. At the station, Klein offered explanations rather than denials. Stress, necessity, control. Ethan listened without response. Back at the clinic that evening, the atmosphere had shifted again. The rescued dogs rested under supervision. Some slept. Others watched every movement with guarded attention. The puppies stirred faintly as Atlas lay beside the enclosure. For the first time, one small paw pressed against the mesh unconsciously. Sarah noticed. "He responds to Atlas," she said quietly. "Heart rate drops every time." Ethan watched the interaction without speaking, just as he knew moved slowly. Recovery did too, but both had begun, and this time nothing was being left behind. The days after Klein's arrest did not arrive with relief. They arrived with process. Court filings replaced field notes, evidence bags became inventory lists. The case moved forward in clean, orderly steps that bore little resemblance to the chaos that had uncovered it. For Ethan Cole, the shift was disorienting. He had spent years working cases where resolution came slowly, often quietly, but this one lingered differently. It did not end with an arrest. It widened. The clinic became the center of that widening. By the third day, the temporary holding areas were full. Dogs rescued from the barn were assessed one by one, some sedated to allow examination, others too withdrawn to require restraint. Their conditions varied: malnutrition, dehydration, injection site infections, but the pattern was consistent. These animals had not been neglected by accident. They had been managed, measured, and discarded when they no longer fit the purpose. Ethan arrived each morning before his shift officially began. Atlas followed him through the doors without hesitation, moving through the clinic as if the space had become an extension of his working environment. He adjusted his posture automatically around the dogs, lowering his head, slowing his movements, allowing proximity without pressure. The effect was subtle but measurable. Heart rates dropped. Vocalization decreased. Several dogs that had refused food began eating in Atlas's presence. Sarah Whitman noticed it first. She was seated on the floor of one enclosure, coaxing a thin shepherd mix toward a bowl, when Atlas lay down just outside the gate. The dog paused, watched him, then stepped forward. "He's regulating them," Sarah said quietly later, as she logged vitals. Her voice carried equal parts surprise and certainty. Not training, just stabilizing. Sarah had grown more reserved since the rescue. She spoke less during rounds, focused more intensely on routine tasks. Ethan recognized the signs. Compassion fatigue had brushed against her before. Years earlier, during her internship, a kennel fire had killed several animals overnight. She had been the one to open the door the next morning. Since then, she coped by narrowing her attention to what could be done now, not what had already failed. Dr. Lillian Moore worked longer hours than usual, though she never mentioned it. She reviewed lab results personally, coordinated with animal control, and fielded calls from the state veterinary board. Her manner remained composed, but Ethan noticed the way she paused before signing off on final reports, as if each name on the list carried weight. The puppy, still unnamed, remained isolated from the others. Neonatal care required a different rhythm: temperature regulation, feeding intervals, oxygen monitoring. Progress came in increments small enough to miss if one wasn't looking carefully. The puppy's weight increased by grams, not ounces. His breathing stabilized, then faltered, then stabilized again. Atlas stayed near him whenever allowed. He did not interfere. He did not crowd. He simply lay close enough to be present. When technicians entered the room, the puppy startled less if Atlas was there. When Atlas shifted position, the puppy adjusted instinctively, pressing toward the warmth. On the fourth day, a woman arrived from animal control to assist with placement evaluations. Her name was Marisol Grant, mid-40s, medium height, sturdy build, shaped by outdoor work rather than gym routines. Her hair, once black, had faded to salt and pepper and was tied back in a practical braid. She had worked animal welfare cases for over 20 years, long enough to develop a blunt honesty that bordered on abruptness. "These dogs will need time," Marisol said, reviewing the intake sheets. "Some longer than others, a few won't make placement." Ethan appreciated the lack of false optimism. "What about the puppy?" he asked. Marisol glanced through the glass toward the neonatal enclosure. "Too early to tell, but he's got a better start than most." That afternoon, Sheriff Mercer stopped by the clinic unannounced. He stood in the hallway, hat in hand, eyes scanning the controlled disorder. He had spent most of his career responding after damage was done. This place felt different, preventative, fragile. "Klein's hearing is set," Mercer said when Ethan joined him. "No plea yet. His attorney's pushing for medical evaluation." "Competency?" Ethan asked. "Control," Mercer replied. "Different thing." They walked together past the enclosures. Mercer paused near one where a young shepherd lay curled in the corner, eyes tracking movement, but body still. "Cases like this don't end clean," he said. "They fade out." Ethan nodded. He knew. That evening, after most staff had left, Ethan remained at the clinic longer than required. Atlas lay beside the neonatal enclosure, eyes half-lidded but alert. The puppy stirred, producing a faint sound, less a cry than an effort. Ethan watched as Atlas lifted his head slightly, then settled again. The puppy pressed closer to the mesh, tiny body angling toward the presence it had come to recognize. Sarah entered quietly. "He's responding more consistently," she said. "Neurologically, that's a good sign." Ethan did not answer immediately. He was watching Atlas. The dog's posture had changed over the past days. He moved more slowly, checked behind him more often. It wasn't distraction. It was accommodation. "Have you thought about a name?" Sarah asked, almost as an aside. Ethan shook his head. "Not yet." She nodded. "No rush." Later that night, Ethan returned home for the first time since the storm. His house was modest, functional, gear hung where it belonged. Everything was in order, too much so. Atlas walked to the rooms with practiced familiarity, then stopped in the living room and waited. Ethan stood there longer than necessary. He realized, with mild surprise, that the silence felt heavier than the noise at the clinic. The next morning brought incremental change. The puppy opened one eye briefly during a feeding. Sarah caught it and froze, afraid to move too quickly. The moment passed, but it had happened. Marisol checked in again. "When he's stable enough," she said, "we'll need to decide placement." Ethan looked at Atlas, who lay nearby, unbothered by the attention, but aware of it. The puppy slept pressed toward the side closest to him. "I'll foster," Ethan said, without emphasis. Marisol studied him for a moment. "That's a big commitment." "So is leaving him here," Ethan replied. She nodded once. "Temporary," she said. "For now." That afternoon, paperwork began. No announcements, no declarations, just forms, signatures, contingencies. Ethan read each page carefully. Atlas watched from the floor, posture neutral. The chapter did not end with celebration. It ended with adjustment. The dogs continued their slow progress. Klein's case moved forward in the background. The puppy slept, breathed, gained weight. Atlas stayed close. Ethan learned the rhythm of care alongside the rhythm of duty. Nothing had returned to normal, but something had settled. The decision to foster did not change the rhythm of the clinic immediately. Paperwork moved at its own pace, and care still followed protocol rather than intention. What changed was Ethan's awareness of time. He began measuring days not by shifts or reports, but by feeding intervals, weight checks, and the small incremental signs that indicated progress rather than survival. The puppy remained in neonatal care, but the environment around him softened. The enclosure was adjusted to allow limited visual exposure to movement beyond the glass. Light was moderated, sound dampened. Atlas remained a constant presence, positioned just close enough to be seen but not felt. The puppy responded to that consistency. His breathing steadied more quickly after feedings. His startle response diminished. His body began to relax into sleep rather than collapse into it. Dr. Lillian Moore documented each change with clinical precision. Still, Ethan noticed that she lingered longer during examinations, hands resting lightly against the enclosure, as if she were checking something beyond vital signs. Years earlier, a case involving a parvovirus outbreak had forced her to authorize euthanasia for an entire litter. It had been the right call medically. It had never been easy. Since then, she approached recoveries like this one with guarded attention, unwilling to assume success before it was earned. On the 6th morning, the puppy opened both eyes fully for the first time. They were dark and unfocused, still adjusting to light, but present. Sarah Whitman noticed it during a feeding and stopped mid-motion, afraid that movement might undo the moment. "He's seeing now," she said quietly. Atlas lifted his head at the change in Sarah's tone. The puppy's gaze drifted, unfixed, until it landed on the darker shape near the floor. His head tilted slightly. One small paw moved forward, brushing the blanket. "That's new," Sarah added. "That's recognition." Ethan watched without speaking. He had learned that moments like this were not improved by commentary. By late afternoon, animal control approved the next step. The puppy could be moved out of isolation for brief, controlled exposure periods. Not to other dogs yet, just to space, to variation. Marisol Grant oversaw the transition. She adjusted the enclosure personally, checking stability twice before stepping back. "Slow," she reminded everyone. "He's not behind. He's early." The first exposure lasted less than 10 minutes. Atlas lay a short distance away, body relaxed, head down. The puppy was placed on a padded surface just inside the enclosure door. He trembled briefly, then stilled. His nose lifted, testing the air. When he shifted forward, it was not toward warmth or sound. It was toward Atlas. Marisol watched closely. "That's attachment," she said. "Early, but clear." Ethan nodded once. Later that evening, after most of the clinic had quieted, Ethan sat alone in the small office adjacent to the treatment area. A single desk lamp cast a circle of light over the foster agreement in front of him. The form was standard, temporary custody. Review after evaluation, no guarantees. He signed his name with the same steady pressure he used on duty reports. When he stood, Atlas followed him into the hallway. The puppy slept, chest rising and falling, in a pattern that no longer looked like effort. Sarah stepped out of a side room and paused. "You'll need to list a name," she said gently. "For records." Ethan hesitated. He had avoided that question deliberately. Names carried expectation. They implied outcome. Atlas shifted beside him. The puppy stirred faintly. "Eli," Ethan said finally. Sarah wrote it down without comment. "It fits," she said after a moment. That night, Ethan brought Eli home. The transport was careful, deliberate. The puppy was secured in a padded carrier, temperature regulated, movement minimized. Atlas rode in the back as usual, but his posture was different, more alert. He watched the carrier continuously, adjusting his position whenever the road shifted. Ethan's house greeted them with quiet. It was a single-story structure on the edge of town, bordered by open land and a stand of trees that broke the wind. Inside, everything was ordered by habit rather than preference. Furniture placed for function, no excess, no decoration beyond what served a purpose. Atlas entered first, moving through the space in a slow, familiar circuit. He paused at doorways, checked corners, then returned to the center of the living room and sat. He waited. Ethan set the carrier down and opened it carefully. Eli did not move at first. The room was new, the air unfamiliar. Then Atlas lay down a few feet away, turning his head slightly to offer his profile rather than direct eye contact. Eli responded almost immediately. He shifted forward, nose brushing the edge of the carrier, then stretched one small paw onto the floor. His movement was unsteady, but intentional. He paused, looked again toward Atlas, and continued. Ethan watched from a distance, hands at his sides. He did not intervene. The following days established a new routine, feeding schedules aligned with work hours. Veterinary check-ins were frequent but uneventful. Eli gained weight steadily. His coordination improved in uneven bursts, followed by long periods of rest. Atlas adapted without instruction. He slowed his pace during walks, stopped when Eli stopped, positioned himself between the puppy and open space without blocking movement. It was not indulgence. It was calibration. On the third day, Ethan took them both outside for the first time. The yard was quiet, snow partially melted, ground firm beneath patches of ice. Eli hesitated at the threshold. Atlas stepped forward, then paused, glancing back. Eli followed. Halfway across the yard, Eli stumbled. Atlas stopped instantly, body angling slightly to block further movement until the puppy regained balance. When Eli continued, Atlas continued. Ethan felt something shift then. Not relief, not pride, recognition. At the clinic, the other rescued dogs progressed at varying speeds. Some were placed into foster homes, others required longer care. Marisol managed each transition with measured realism. "Not all endings look the same," she said once. "That doesn't mean they're failures." Sheriff Mercer checked in near the end of the week. "Klein's attorney is pushing for mitigation," he said. "It won't change the outcome, just the timeline." Ethan listened, but his focus had narrowed. The case would conclude as cases did. Documentation, testimony, sentencing. Eli slept curled against Atlas that night, one small body pressed against a larger one that did not move away. Atlas remained awake longer than usual, eyes tracking the room, posture alert but unstrained. The noise had settled, not disappeared. Settled. And in that quiet, something durable had taken shape. Spring arrived in Kalispell without announcement. Snow retreated unevenly, leaving behind damp earth and the faint smell of thawing pine. The town adjusted the way it always did, quietly, without ceremony. Plows were parked, roads widened. People returned to habits interrupted but not forgotten. What had happened during the storm no longer showed itself in drifts or broken branches. It lived elsewhere now, in records, in memory, and in the slow recalibration of ordinary days. Ethan Cole settled into a routine that felt unfamiliar at first, then necessary. Mornings began earlier. Eli woke before the alarm most days, small body restless with new energy, paws unsteady but determined. Atlas adjusted automatically. He rose when Eli rose, waited when Eli hesitated, and positioned himself between the puppy and whatever space needed reading before crossing. It was not supervision in the strict sense. It was translation. Eli grew quickly. His coat thickened from sparse gray into a deeper, warmer shade, still uneven in places but improving daily. His eyes sharpened, tracking movement with growing confidence. At 8 weeks, his ears had begun to lift, not fully upright yet, but trying. He stumbled often, corrected himself, and tried again. Each attempt ended with a glance toward Atlas, as if checking whether the effort had been noticed. Ethan watched these exchanges with quiet attention. He did not narrate them. He did not document them. He allowed them to exist without interference. Years earlier, after the loss that had reshaped his caution, he had learned that some processes worked best without oversight. Work resumed its usual demands: reports, patrols, testimony, preparation. The case against Dr. Aaron Klein advanced methodically. Evidence was logged, witness statements collected. No new revelations emerged. That too felt appropriate. The truth, once uncovered, did not require embellishment. Sheriff Mercer called Ethan into his office one afternoon. The older man stood near the window, beard trimmed more neatly than usual, hands clasped behind his back. He looked out over the lot for a moment before speaking. "Klein accepted a plea," Mercer said. "Multiple counts, no trial." Ethan nodded. He had not expected anything else. "Sentence will reflect intent," Mercer continued, "not just outcome." "That matters," Ethan said. Mercer turned, studying him. "You did good work," he said, then added, "all of it." The praise landed without ceremony. Ethan accepted it the same way he accepted most things, without resistance, without attachment. At the clinic, transitions continued. Several of the rescued dogs were placed into foster homes. A few remained under longer care. One older shepherd with chronic joint issues was adopted by a retired couple outside town. Another, younger and more guarded, went to a single handler with experience rehabilitating working breeds. Not every story resolved neatly, but none were left unaddressed. Dr. Lillian Moore called Ethan later that week. Her voice carried a steadiness that suggested closure. "Final assessments are complete," she said. "Eli's cleared, no lasting neurological issues. He's behind where he would have been without the exposure, but not by much." "Thank you," Ethan said. There was a pause. "You made a difference," Lillian added. It was not something she said often. Spring brought training back into focus. Atlas returned to structured work, patrol readiness restored. Ethan scheduled sessions carefully, mindful of balance. Eli accompanied them sometimes, at a distance, observing rather than participating. He watched Atlas work with intense focus, mimicking posture when he could, adjusting when he couldn't. The learning was constant and unforced. One afternoon, Ethan brought them to the edge of town, where open land met the tree line. The ground was soft but firm, snow reduced to shadowed patches beneath trees. Eli hesitated at the boundary, uncertain of the open space ahead. Atlas moved forward a few steps, then stopped. He waited. Eli followed. Ethan stood back, hands resting loosely at his sides. He had stopped trying to predict outcomes. He trusted the process unfolding in front of him. A small memorial was placed near the clinic in early May. It was not elaborate, a flat stone set into the ground beneath a young pine. No ceremony was announced. Those who attended came quietly. Sarah Whitman stood with her hands in her pockets, hair pulled back as usual. Marisol Grant nodded once and stepped aside. Dr. Moore placed the stone herself. The inscription was simple. She gave what she had left. Ethan stood with Atlas and Eli beside him. Eli pressed against Atlas's shoulder, uncertain of the stillness but responsive to it. Atlas did not move. Time passed. Summer approached, and with it, decisions that felt less urgent but no less significant. Ethan finalized the adoption paperwork without hesitation. The signature came easily now. It felt like completion rather than commitment. At home, Eli's presence altered the space in small ways. Toys appeared where none had been before. Food schedules changed. Silence became textured rather than empty. Atlas adjusted without losing himself. He remained precise, attentive, capable. He simply allowed for pause. One evening, after a long day, Ethan sat on the back step and watched the dogs move through the yard. Eli chased insects with clumsy enthusiasm. Atlas observed, intervening only when necessary. When Eli tired and settled beside him, Atlas shifted to accommodate, lowering his shoulders slightly. Ethan felt no rush to define what came next. Some outcomes did not need projection. When winter returned later that year, it arrived gently. Snow fell straight down, unhurried. The first accumulation covered the ground evenly, leaving the forest quiet rather than closed. Ethan took them out along the ridge trail, the same path that had once been swallowed by storm. They moved together now, Atlas ahead, Eli just behind, matching pace. Their tracks overlapped naturally, not because one followed the other, but because they chose the same line. Ethan stopped where the trees opened to a broad view of the valley. He watched the dogs stand side by side, breath visible in the cold air. What remained after the storm was not a story of rescue or justice alone. It was continuity, a sequence of choices made without spectacle, a life preserved, then shaped, a bond formed not through obligation, but through recognition. The noise had faded, the work had been done, and what was left was enough. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through a mother who gives her last strength so her child can live, through a loyal companion who refuses to leave, through a human who chooses compassion over convenience. In moments like these, it's easy to believe that God works not only through grand signs, but through small acts of love placed gently into ordinary lives. A pause instead of walking away, a hand reaching out instead of turning cold, a heart that still believes no one should face fear alone. In our daily lives, we may never stand in a blizzard or hear a cry buried under snow, but every day we are given the same choice: to notice, to care, and to act. And each time we choose kindness, we become part of a quiet miracle ourselves. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in compassion, second chances, and the power of love to heal, subscribe to this channel to support stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and watch over you and those you love. And may you never forget, sometimes the smallest light is enough to guide someone home.